This week we're beginning our section where we are looking at specific genres of art. And here we're going to start with Chapter 8, which is the Drawing chapter. The reason why we start with drawing is because drawing is the foundation of all two-dimensional art. But what's interesting, and your text starts with a discussion of this, it actually wasn't until the Renaissance, meaning the later 15th century, that drawing was actually seen as its own art form. Before this, it was seen as more of a preparation step, that you would draw, you would sketch something out, and then create a different artwork. One of the first drawings to be considered art itself was Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna and Child with St. Anne and infant St. John the Baptist that you see here. This is 1499 to 1500. And people saw this drawing, they were just enamored of it, and they would flock to the room where it was seen. Unfortunately, it actually does not survive to this day. But this was the first recorded account of the public actually admiring a drawing as a work of art. Now, there's also another reason why drawing was not considered an art form, and it's because drawing is usually done on paper. Well, paper for most of history was very expensive. Our first example of paper is papyrus. This was created by the ancient Egyptians around 4000 BCE. And what you do is you take the papyrus plant, you pound it out, and then you paste these strips together. Next, parchment was developed by the ancient Romans sometime after the 2nd century BCE. And what parchment is, it's actually animal skins that have been scraped, soaked, and then dried. Paper arrived to the Western world actually via the Muslim world, who got it from China around 105 BC. The Western world itself did not actually start producing paper until about the 13th century. And this paper at the time was made of scraps of old cloth, meaning hemp, cotton, and linen. In the 15th century, we did have the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg in Germany. For this, we were able to print text much quicker, but again, paper was still pretty expensive. It actually wasn't until the middle of the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, that we got the technology to make the paper that we have today, which is making paper from wood pulp that was paper from wood pulp that produces the easily producible, able to mass produce paper products that we use today. Now, moving on, when we look at drawing, drawing is interesting because drawing by definition is autographic, meaning it literally comes from the author's hand, right? Think about when you get an autograph, right? It's the person signing their name. So this is autographic. It is created by the hand of the artist. Now, usually, again, like I said earlier, drawing was seen as more as preliminary works, meaning you would maybe practice or you would sketch out what you're going to do. And we see that here in another drawing, a study of a sleeve for Leonardo da Vinci. Here is where he was working on in an upcoming work. He was going to create a sleeve. So we see this, that he is preparing to do this through this preliminary sketch. Again, the chief purpose of a drawing such as this is to prepare and design compositions of a work. Because of this, it often allows us to see more of the artist's personality in their process, especially if we get drafts of different artworks. Now, when we talk about drawing, your book also mentions the word cartoon. The term cartoon actually comes from the Italian cartone, C-A-T-O-N-E, which means paper or drawing done to scale for a painting or a fresco. So when we talk about cartoon, that is actually where it comes from, is the Italian. Now, what we're going to see when we look at some of these different genres of art is usually when we discuss them, we're actually going to look at the different media or medium that is used, meaning literally what is created from. So within drawing, we have two main categories. We have dry media, which includes metal point, chalk, charcoal, graphite, pastel, and oil stick, and then wet media, which is pen and ink and wash and brush. And we're going to go through these, talk about what they are, and then I want you to think, as you're looking at these, think of what advantages and disadvantages they each have. So let's start with dry media. Dry media, we have our pigment, which is our coloring agent, and it's put in some sort of binder. And what the binder is, It's a substance that holds the pigment together. Now, this binder is not always required. Sometimes we're going to see media that is just the pure pigment itself. So we'll begin with metal point. Metal point was developed in the late 15th and early 16th century. What happens is you use a stylus made of metal, and the stylus is applied to a paper that has been treated. Usually it's powdered bones or lead white, and then gum water is added, which is it's from a tree. What happens when you do this? The line that is created is a pale gray. It is very delicate, and it cannot be widened by increasing pressure. So if you push down harder on the stylus, you're still going to get the same line. Also with metal point is it cannot be erased without resurfacing the entire paper. Almost think about it as the old Etch-a-Sketches, right? You can't go back and erase a little part. You have to do all of it. And what you're looking at here, this is an example of the metal point. This is also by Leonardo Da Vinci, and it is a study of a woman's head or of the Angel of the Verge de la Roche. This is from 1473, and actually silver point with white highlights on prepared paper. Right, moving on, next, this is one most of you are probably familiar with, and that's chalk. Chalk is actually a soft white limestone, calcium carbonate, and it's actually formed from the skeletal remains of sea creatures. Chalk is a softer media that leaves the pigment behind on the paper. Now, chalk itself, it requires paper with what we call a tooth, meaning something it can hold on to. Because think about when you write chalk on a chalkboard, right? Chalkboards have kind of more of this porous substance. Why? Because the chalk has to have something to hold on to. Imagine if you took a piece of chalk and you colored it just on regular printer paper, it's not going to stick to that. Why? Because that's smooth. There's no tooth, nothing for it to hold on to. Also with chalk, with it holding on, it's very delicate. So if we want it to become permanent, we need to put some sort of resin on the paper. Because, think about this, if you ever had old chalk drawings, eventually the pigment's going to literally fall off the paper. It's also easier to give a sense of volume with chalk because you can increase the darkness and the lightness of the line with the increased paper. And so, with increased pressure, and you can see that in examples such as this. You can see the shading here. The darker areas, the artist pushed down harder on the chalk, and that's going to leave more pigment behind. All right, next is charcoal, and charcoal is simply made from burnt wood. It can be hard or it can be soft. Now, charcoal is very easily manipulated. It can be smudged and it can be smeared, which is also very frustrating if you're working with it because it smudges very, very easily. It's often if you're working with charcoal, you'll often get your little fingerprints all over the paper too. Charcoal was also used in the Renaissance to outline frescoes, the large wall paintings. Why? Because the artists could kind of draw out their sketch and then they could easily remove the charcoal from the surface. Just like chalk, it requires paper with a tooth for it to hold on to, and it also needs to be set with some sort of resin. What's interesting, both chalk and charcoal, a good resin in today's day and age is actually aerosol hairspray. You can usually spray your work with this and it'll save it. Here's another example of charcoal, and you could see here, this is by Kat Kollwitz. It's Self-Portrait, and it's Drawing, 1933. And this is just charcoal on brown lane paper. And you can see here the added pressure, like on her arms. You can see that darker line. That means that's more pressure was added. And in the face, to get the detailing, we see kind of more of the smudging and the shading. Next is graphite. This is something most of us are familiar with. Graphite is a soft form of carbon, and it's similar to coal. Graphite actually wasn't discovered, it was kind of discovered almost simultaneously, but it was discovered in England in 1564, and it comes in a range of hardness and softness. Think about this, when you take a Scantron test, you have to have a number 2 pencil. That's referring to the hardness of the lead. If the graphite is not hard enough, the machine literally cannot read it. So what happens here with graphite? The harder the lead is, it actually leaves less of the graphite behind. So if you're going to do something you want very delicate lines, you're going to look for actually a harder graphite. Comes in two main forms. The first is what's called the pencil. The traditional pencil was the graphite was surrounded by a wood casing to protect it. Obviously, we know now we've got also metal ones, plastic ones. And the other one is what's called a Conte crayon, C-O-N-T-E. And this is where the graphite is actually mixed with clay to keep it binded together. And the work you're looking at here, this is by Georges Seurat, and it's The Artist's Mother from 1882 to 83. And this is actually this Conte crayon on paper. I included this because I think it's a wonderful image. This is just called Untitled. It's often referred to as Ocean from 1970. And this is graphite on acrylic ground on paper. And this is an example of what we call a photorealist graphite drawing, meaning it looks so realistic, it almost looks like a photograph. All right, moving on to pastels. Pastels are actually a chalk medium, but what happens is a chalk medium with color pigment and a non-greasy binder is added to it. Now, pastels can come in a variety of soft, medium, and hard. The softer a pastel it is, the more pigment it's left behind, and just like chalk, right, it's actually harder to work with. It kind of crumbles on you. The harder it is, that means there's more binder in it, and it's not as delicate, but it leaves less pigment behind. Again, pastels are extremely fragile. They need to have that paper with tooth, and then they must be fixed or it'll eventually fall off the paper. And you can see in the work here, this is done with some of the harder pastels because you can see those definitive lines. A work such as this, these are going to be those softer pastels, and you almost have this kind of watery effect to it. And then here's just another example of a work with pastels, so you can see the variety of pigments that they can come in. All right, and then the last of our dry media is what's called oil stick. Now these are interesting. What they actually are is they're actually made of oil paint. However, they have enough of the binder, which is wax, that they become molded into a stick form. It's almost like a crayon, if you will. And this allows the artist to literally draw with paint. And this is an image, the same one from your book. I'm sorry, it's not a great one. This is the only one I could find. But this is by Sandy Brooke, and it's called Fate and Luck Eclipse. This is from 2011, and it is oil stick on linen. All right, well now moving on to the wet media or the liquid media. This is exactly as the name implies. This is where the pigment is suspended in a liquid binder. Okay, we have some sort of liquid. This usually gives works more of a more fluid appearance, and usually you need the binder to actually sink into the paper itself. So just like our example with chalk, how it would not work well with regular printer paper, think about your wet media. It's not going to work that well either. If you've ever tried to use water paints on just regular copier paper, does not work well. Why? Because it doesn't sink in. Usually you want something a little more fiber-based, and it'll the work will be much more permanent within it. Now, first what we're going to look at is called pen and ink. Traditionally, this was iron gall ink, and this was made from iron salts and an acid that was obtained from what's called a nut gall. A nut gall was actually swelling on an oak tree. And then with this, it's actually black, but it turns to brown with age. So you can see that in the work here. This is the Holy Family with a kneeling monastic saint from circa 1660. It's pen and brown ink on paper. So you can see here, right, you get this much more fluidness to it. Now, the more diluted the pigment, meaning the more liquid you add to it, the more flow you have. Now with this, right, pen and ink dries very fast, and it cannot be removed once it's on the paper. So once it's there, you cannot go back and take it away. See some of the other examples here. This one, I want you to see this because here you can definitely see some of that shading that more of the water, more of the liquid has been added. Look at the figures and look at the shadows, right? We can see the more definitive lines. That's where we're going to have more pigment, less binder. And then almost the watery, cloudy areas, that's going to have more of the binder, less of the pigment. And then this one is an interesting one. This is also a pen and ink, and this is what's called a Gibson Girl. And here I thought I'd include this because you can see the lines, and the shading here is done by using that hatching technique we talked about earlier in the semester. All right, next we have what's called wash and brush. And this is where the ink is diluted with water, and it's actually applied by a brush. It is an extremely fluid media, but it can be very difficult to work with. It dries very quickly, and it cannot be removed. And so here what you're looking at, this is by Chuta. It's 1626 or after. And we see here, this is tree work type. It's a vertical, it's actually made, it's created on a vertical scroll. So we have this ink and the wash and brush on paper. And then here's kind of a closer detailing of it. So you can see how fluid this can get when we add more of the binder to it. Now we talked about all these individually. However, there are often works where they are used together, and this is what we call combination. And so what we're looking at with these combination works, right? You can see here, 3 layers deep, we have a preliminary graphite sketch, then we have pen and ink drawing, and then the brown wash was used for the shading. Here you can see it, oh, and it's the Adoration of the Magi. Here's another work that has this combination to it. This is pen and black ink with brush and brown wash over black chalk on ivory laid paper. And so you can see the different medias are chosen to help create the works. All right, now this section that we're going to look at, this is very important because this is going to go along with your activity, your drawing with scissors activity for this chapter. And so what we're looking at is with drawing often invites experimentation. And what you'll have to do here, there's this YouTube clip here. You'll actually have to go to the slides I have also posted and click on the YouTube video, link there. If you try to click on it in this lecture, it won't take you there. But you have to watch this short video so you understand what you're going to do. But what happens is we have the artist Henri Matisse. Matisse was in the early 1940s, and what happened to him as he got older, he wasn't quite as able to create works how he used to. So he came up with this idea, and he calls it drawing with scissors. And what happens in this is he would actually cut shapes out of paper or in paper with the scissors, using them open, almost like a knife. And what he says is, he said, scissors can acquire more feeling for line than pencil or charcoal. He actually continued with this until his death in 1954. And so what he would do, as you're looking at these images, these were things, he would plan them out. They weren't just spontaneous. They weren't just, randomly cut out pieces of paper. He would plan the composition, and then he'd either find colored paper or he'd have his assistants literally paint paper the color he wanted, and then he would cut out the shapes. So after this lecture is done, be sure to go watch this YouTube video, otherwise you will not understand what is required of you in the drawing with scissors exercise. All right, continuing on, some other innovative drawing media. This is by Whitfield Lovell, and it's called Whispers from the Walls from 1999, and it's what we call mixed media. And what he did is, it was actually a recreation of a 1920s North Texas home that was lived in by an African-American family who worked in the fields. So you can see literally this is a room, right? And it's a recreation of the room they would live in. But what he did is he places these charcoal drawings on the wall. And he created these drawings from photographs that he studied of the people who actually lived there. So that's why it says Whispers from a Wall. Like, we've all gone to historic homes and you go look at, the rooms where people lived, but we often don't see them. Well, he wanted us to see these individuals, so he literally drew them on the wall. Here, again, these clips you'll have to go look at on the slides that are posted. But this is by William Kentridge. He is a South African artist. And what he does is he uses these drawings to create animated film. But they're drawn from a single drawing in charcoal and pastel on paper. And so it's interesting. Please go watch part of this because you'll see what we see as the story goes on is he's literally drawing on it, and we see the change. What we're going to look at, it's called The History of the Main Complaint from 1996, which is a film, and this is only a small segment of it. But this was actually based on his memories of apartheid, which was the legal segregation and racism in South Africa, which now is actually outlawed. So please do go watch this. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in innovative drawing is actually comic books and graphic novels. The difference is comic books are usually intended for a younger audience. Graphic novels are intended for older readers. And what happens is the comic books exploded in the 1940s and the 1950s, and then graphic novels in more recent years. And what these do is they literally tell stories through panels of drawings. And the example that I have for you here, if you've never looked at this, go look at it. It's called Mouse. It's by Art Spiegelman. And it's Mouse, A Survivor's Tale from 1986. And this actually tells the tale of his parents. His parents were Polish Jews, and it tells their tale during World War II. But what he does is he takes the characters, and instead of having them human, he turns them into animals. So the Jews are mice, the Germans are actually cats, and the Americans are actually represented by dogs. So it's interesting how he's retelling this history, literally his parents' story, through this cartoon. All right, well, that concludes this lecture. Please be sure to go look at the links I've provided for you, and definitely go look at the Drawing with Scissors clip. Otherwise, you are not going to understand the activity.